I'm standing in the middle of what is today called Boston Common. 44 acres. Was used always as pasture land in 1630 when the Puritans first established Boston. And this is probably as good a place as any to begin our journey on the Freedom Trail.
250 years ago, this was the hotbed for radical thought and for the birth of a new nation called the United States of America. Now, in 2020, we're forced to rethink our definition of freedom and how we can make a just world for all. So you know you're on the Freedom Trail when you see the brick that takes us on the 2.5 miles past the various sites, primarily with the American Revolution, with our other stops that deal with other important people and places and events that dealt with freedom in this country.
This is Massachusetts State Capitol building, called the new State House. Replaced the one that was further in town called the old State House. It was built in 1795. Its cornerstone was laid then. Sam Adams and Paul Revere were in attendance for the beginning ceremonies. This is one of the most beautiful state houses in the country. You see the roof there is clad in gold. Originally it was wood shakes and it was replaced by copper that was sheathed by Paul Revere's company. And after the Civil War it became this golden gilded rooftop. So it's an amazing structure. It's the beginning of the Freedom Trail, and we're going to go on from here.
So I'm at the Park Street Church, and this is where William Lloyd Garrison gave his first public address against slavery back in 1829. So he's calling for freedom to end slavery in this country for African Americans.
Cemetery in Boston. There are many people buried here. Among them is John Hancock, the famous signature of the Declaration of Independence, one of the original Sons of Liberty, one of the guys that really begins the revolution, and this is where he's buried. At this burial ground, there are 9 governors that are buried here. Paul Revere is buried here, John Hancock. Also, 5 victims of the famous Boston Massacre. In March of 1770, these 5 people were shot by British soldiers at the old State House. And really, that's one of the most important steps in the beginning of the American Revolution. But there's also other people buried here as well.
So I'm at the burial ground of Sam Adams, and he's famous for the beer, but back in 1776, he was the most famous troublemaker of the American Revolution. And he was able to make people understand the importance of fighting for freedom, and he plays a central role here in Boston.
Burial ground. This is actually the oldest burial ground in the entire city. And many people are buried here of importance. One of them is William Dawes Jr., who was one of the riders that went out in the night of April 19, 1775 with Paul Revere. So the story of Paul Revere is a simplified one. There are actually several riders that went out. Among them are William Dawes Jr., and he's buried right here.
We're at the site of the Boston Latin School, and it's the first public school in America. And its most famous dropout is a man named Benjamin Franklin. Although he dropped out of school, he was a lifelong learner and shows the importance of, if we want a democracy and we want freedom, we need a quality education.
For historians and teachers like us, that love American history, Boston is basically ground zero. It's one of the most important places to visit in terms of the American Revolution and the beginning of the American experience in North America.
For example, right here, some of the greatest literary minds ever in American history. Hawthorne, Thoreau, Emerson, all right here in Boston, having conversations just like Mr. Bukhari and I. And now look at it.
I'm hungry. It's the Old South Meeting House. It's one of the most important shrines to the American Revolution. It's a gathering place, one of the largest buildings in the 1770s in Boston. This is where the population protested after the Boston Massacre in 1770. Also, this is where they gathered before the Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773. So if you come to the Freedom Trail, this is a must stop. It was near this spot on a cold night in March of 1770. The British soldier stood at his post. A mob surrounding him. Tensions had been building for weeks. They began throwing bricks and rocks at the soldier. Captain Preston of the 29th Regiment of Foot was called out and came to the aid of one of his soldiers. The soldier is knocked down. He fired a shot. The other soldiers started firing into the crowd. The result were 5 colonists that were killed. That is the Boston Massacre. One of the first ones to die, an African American named Crispus Attucks. It happened here on this spot.
Here we are at the old State House, and this is the site of where James Otis, shortly after the French and Indian War, questioned whether we should be paying taxes to England 3,000 miles away. And he came up with the catchy phrase, no taxation without representation, right here at the old State House. This site is called Faneuil Hall, and Marquis de Lafayette called this the cradle of liberty. So since its beginning, it's been a marketplace, and then on the second floor, it's been a meeting house. So for the past 250 years, people have gathered to share their opinions and debate in public how they feel about government and the role of government in the United States.
We're here at the north end of Boston, home of someone you probably heard of, a man named Paul Revere. Silversmith, famous man for making a ride in April of 1775. But in this house, he fathered 16 children, lived a long life, and a very important guy in the American Revolution.
Think of Paul Revere as the Sybil Ludington of Boston. And in fact, scratch that, because he did not even make it the entire way. He got caught, and actually we should also be celebrating Preston and Dawes, who actually made the full journey without getting caught. So in my personal opinion, Paul Revere, a little overrated.
In April of 1775, Boston is an occupied town, and the British Army had a plan, and their plan was to take away the weapons and the gunpowder that the colonists had stockpiled in Lexington and Concord. And on the night of April 18, 1775, the British were going to go on a night raid into the countryside. Now this steeple was going to be where the Sons of Liberty are basically going to warn Paul Revere, and he would go on his famous ride. And the famous saying was, 1 lantern if the British moved by land, 2 if by sea. 2 lanterns were shown in the steeple. Revere got on his horse and eventually got to Lexington and Concord first. So it was in this church that the signals were made.
So I'm here at the tombstone of Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather was a prolific writer and preacher during the colonial time, and he helped establish some of the Puritan work ethic that this area in New England is known for, but unfortunately he's also responsible for some of the racist policies that got indoctrinated into the early foundations of American history. And it's only now with books like Stamped from the Beginning are we coming to grips with the full context of the life and influence of Cotton Mather.
This is the oldest commissioned ship in the Navy. The sailors are still active Navy members, and it is one of the most incredible ships ever built by the U.S. Navy. It was nicknamed Old Ironsides. It was used in the War of 1812.
Freedom of seas is very important. So John Adams, as second president of the United States, recognized that the United States needed a Navy to be taken seriously as a world power. So he created the Department of Navy, and one of the first ships created as Department of Navy was the USS Constitution.
Of June 17, 1775, British plans were set in motion. General Howe, leading his troops from this spot, going up that hill, would attack the Americans that had fortified Breed's Hill. That monument is the monument to the Battle of Bunker Hill, which the battle becomes known as. So it is from this spot that the British attack began.
So I'm at the statue of William Prescott, and he is advising his militia soldiers to be careful with their ammunition and be patient before they fire upon the British who are coming up the hill. And he's most famous for the saying, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." So that's essentially how close you had to be before you had to fire your musket for it to be effective. And these are troops that are fighting the British for the first time, and they're going to be nervous, but they're going to have good leadership and be able to fight off at least twice the British assault on Bunker Hill.
Well, we've come to the end of the Freedom Trail. We hope you enjoyed your journey with us. We hope that you follow in our footsteps and encourage your family and friends to do the same thing.
Although this is the last stop on the Freedom Trail, we hope you're inspired by the Freedom Trail, and remember that the struggle for freedom continues, and now it's our turn.